Welcome everybody to Module 3, where we're going to be taking a look at middle childhood. So this is a period of development following the early years. So now we're thinking elementary school age. Okay, that's kind of what we're talking about with middle childhood. And so we're just kind of getting up toward looking at adolescence next, adulthood, and then late adulthood to round out the semester. But here we're going to be talking about cognitive development and self and moral development in middle childhood. So one of the important things to talk about with cognitive development in middle childhood is brain growth, right? Now we know, again, that brains don't develop normally without some sort of genetic code, right? So genes do play a role in how brains grow and develop. But we also know that brains don't develop and grow in the absence of some sort of environment, right? So brains are growing in a social context of some kind, right? We talked about experience-dependent learning. So the brain grows and matures in the context of having certain experiences with the environment that help with pattern recognition, starting to learn cause and effect, and so on. Again, we're talking here about the dynamic interaction between nature and nurture, right? That genes and experience interact in a dynamic way to influence how the brain is organized. There really is no easy, quick answer to the question, right? Is it brain or behavioral change that's genetic or determined by experience, right? So is all of this change in the brain purely the result of a genetic code, or is it determined by a person's experience? Again, the answer is both, right? It's always going to be both when it comes to this class. We're never going to go into, biological reductionism and just say it's all genes, but we're also not going to go swing the other way and say it's all social experiences, right? It's both. But some of the important aspects of brain growth in middle childhood is this rapid growth of white matter and myelination. Remember, it's called white matter because of those myelin sheaths that surround the nerve cells. And the importance of myelination in this period of development is that more myelinated neurons lead to faster, more efficient neural communication and integration of brain regions. We're going to see massive improvements in motor functioning with kids in elementary school as compared to like a 4 or 5-year-old, right? Their gross and fine motor skills are going to develop in part because of this brain maturation. So some of the important outcomes of brain growth then would be improved executive functioning. So again, executive functioning is going to be one of the important concepts or themes from this course. So remember, we have things like working memory, the ability to hold multiple pieces of information in your mind when solving a problem. We have like inhibitory control, self-regulation, right? That's another really key aspect of executive functioning, and behavioral inhibition. During this period, kids are able to focus their attention more and use more selective attention as a strategy. So now we're beginning to see the emergence of specific strategies to solve certain problems. And a lot of this brain growth and improvement in executive functioning is correlated positively with academic achievement later in life. And this is where it's important to again recall from Module 1 the impact of chronic or toxic stress on a developing brain. And so we can understand why for children living in poverty, right, academic achievement may lag behind some of their more affluent peers as a result of certain disruptions in early brain development related to living under chronic stress. So we're going to review some of the basic points of Piaget's stages of cognitive development. So recall that one of the really key ideas from Piaget's theory is that knowledge itself is constructed It's not just stamped into our head by experience, right? We take in new information and we change that information, right? We change it and interpret it in ways that fit with what we already know or with how our thinking is already structured. And at the same time, we accommodate or adjust that existing knowledge to fit in what is new, right? And so this is a dynamic process that unfolds when we're learning. So an example of this, a good example of how kids construct knowledge or how we construct knowledge was done in this experiment, right? They did this experiment and they've replicated this experiment across many different countries and cultures. And it's pretty basic, right? I mean, most of us, when we're little, notice that when we go outside and we're walking around, everything looks flat, right? The earth looks flat. And in fact, right, for many centuries, a lot of people believe that the earth is flat. We still have some flat earthers out there. And so what they do in this experiment is they ask kids to explain how the earth is round because, right, you learn that in school. So this is a good example of constructing knowledge because we learn that the earth is spherical, right? We learn that scientists believe that the earth is spherical, that it's round. And yet kids all seem to think that it's flat. So they have to assimilate this new information, right, with what they already know, with their current existing knowledge structures. And so this is kind of how they do it, right? So some kids would say, well, okay, so the earth is round, all right. Well, maybe the earth is just like a flat disc, right? It's like round, but it's kind of flat. So it might still be round, but it's more flattened. Or some kids would say, well, okay, so the earth is kind of like a ball, and it's got this kind of like dome underneath it, which is the sky. And so it's the sky that makes the earth spherical. And so they kind of imagine this sort of planet where, it's like the land is sort of this flat surface and then there's this dome of the sky around us. So this is an example of how kids start to construct some of their own maybe theories or understandings based on what they already know with the new information that they're learning. And this is the thing, right? Kids in the middle years of life are confronted with all kinds of new information every day, right? In school, they're learning constantly, new facts, new ideas. And so they have to try and find a way to reconcile all of this new information with their existing store of knowledge. And this is, again, how we construct and accommodate knowledge as we learn. So we are in middle childhood in the concrete operational stage of Piaget's theory, right? Logical thinking starts to emerge a little bit more. And it's kind of hard to say what logical thinking is exactly, to give a sort of short definition. But we can say that it does involve taking multiple sets of information and finding the associated links between those pieces of information. And so you'll recall, right, that in the early years, right, that preschoolers are very centered in their thinking, meaning that they can only focus on one thing, one particular thing at a time. It's hard for them to consider multiple pieces of information and how all that information is linked together. Here, in the concrete operational stage, kids are able to decenter a little bit more and hold more information as their brains are growing and maturing, right? So again, executive functions are improving. So working memory is improving. So now they're able to hold more information in their head simultaneously. So for example, preschoolers can learn these facts pretty easily. 2 + 1 = 3, right? A preschooler can learn that fairly easily. 3 - 1 = 2. Again, learning those facts is relatively straightforward. But it's when a child recognizes the reversible relationships between these facts that we're seeing more evidence of decentered logical thinking. In other words, right, if the first math fact is true, if 2 + 1 = 3 is true, then the second fact has to be true as well, right? Because knowing the first fact allows us to deduce the second one if we can think in reversible relationships. So if we start with the number 2 and add 1, we get 3. But if we take 1 away from 3, we can get back to 2, meaning that there's an inverse relationship between adding and subtracting. But again, this is very, very hard for young kids to do, to hold in mind these reversible relationships. It's when brain growth allows more working memory, selective attention, right? That we're able to take in more information and start to put pieces of information together like this, that subtraction is the inverse of addition, and addition the inverse of subtraction. And then we learn the same thing with multiplication and division later. And so we have this challenge of the abstract versus the concrete, right? Most people, even adults, struggle with abstract thinking, abstract concepts. Define love, right? It's kind of an abstract concept, right? There are a lot of different ways of thinking about it. School-age kids seem to be most capable when the problems they're solving relate to concrete information, right? So keeping information concrete, based in sort of concrete reality with observable, countable, measurable things is a little bit easier than thinking about something like what is love, right? If you ask a 6 or 7 year old what is love, right, they'll probably give you some interesting answer, but it's kind of hard for them to talk and think and theorize about more abstract things. But when a problem is disconnected from what's familiar, right, from realistic content, kids tend to have a more difficult time identifying what's relevant, right? What are the relevant aspects of this problem, and finding how those aspects are related to each other. So to give an example of the previous slide on abstract versus concrete, consider these 2 questions. Suppose it is true that if P occurs, then Q occurs, and suppose that Q has not occurred. Has P occurred? Right? And now if you sit and think about that question, you could probably answer it correctly. But it might take a little bit of thinking. Well, how about the second one? Suppose that it is true that if a rock is thrown at a window, then the window will break. And suppose that the window is not broken. Has a rock been thrown at the window? Which of these 2 questions do you think are easier for kids to answer? Well, and it should be pretty clear now, right? It's the second one is a lot easier to answer because it relates to concrete contents, rock and window, right? Versus P and Q. P and Q are kind of abstract variables, right? That don't represent anything specific. And the answer is the same to both questions, right? But concrete thinkers tend to find the first example more challenging, right? So kids are going to find that first question a lot harder to answer than the second one. And there are other ways in which this kind of shows up, right? They've done experiments, for example, where they'll give kids a statement and ask them to respond, is it true, is it false, or I can't tell. And so what they'll do in these experiments, for example, is an experimenter will hold like a poker chip in their hand, and they'll close their fist, right? So the kid can't see the color of the poker chip. And then they'll tell the kids, is the chip, I've got a poker chip in my hand, is it green or not green? It's either green or not green, right, is what they'll ask them. And they'll say, is that true, false, or I can't tell? Now, the statement's truth has nothing to do with the actual color of the chip, right? The truth of this statement has nothing to do with anything in the concrete world. The truth of this statement is related to the linguistic elements in the sentence itself. It's either true or false. I've got a poker chip in my hand. It's either green or not green. We can answer that question without ever seeing the poker chip. We don't need to check anything in the concrete world. A chip, any chip of any kind, is either green or it's not green. Okay, and so this is an example of how we can kind of test or assess a child's ability to think logically about problems. So to get a little more into some of the cognitive development that unfolds in middle childhood and in the elementary school years, we can go back to one of Piaget's famous number conservation tasks to get an idea of some of the changes we observe cognitively in children from preschool up through the later elementary years. So if you look at the two pictures here, the one on the left, right, has 4 coins top, 4 coins on bottom. The one on the right, same, right, 4 coins on top and 4 coins on bottom. Now on the left, it's pretty easy for both preschoolers and older elementary school students to note that there are the exact same number of coins in both the top row and the bottom row. But if you look over to the picture on the right, older elementary school students will still know that there are the same number of coins in each row, but younger students, so like in preschool, right, they tend to think that the top row on the right has more coins than the bottom because they are more spread out, and so it looks like they cover more space, and so there must be more of them. And so what does this show us, right? It shows us that in preschool, right, kids are still centered, remember, right? That idea of being centered, being able to focus only on one aspect of a problem at a time. And in this case, preschoolers who think that there are more coins on the top in the right picture are more focused on the spacing, and they're not understanding the kind of relationship between, density, that as the coins are spread out more, they're less dense, but there are still the same number of coins. Whereas older students can look at the top and bottom row of the right picture and see that, even though they're spread out more, there are still 4, right? In other words, older students, right, in elementary school, understand that this relationship between spacing and density, that just because we spread them out more doesn't mean that there are more of them. So again, this is giving us an example of the improved cognitive skills that unfold in middle childhood. So for children at this stage of development, it's still pretty common for them to retain really strong preferences for certain ideas, that if they have their own little pet theories or understandings of the world, that it's really hard for them to think outside of those theories or understandings. Kids still cling, we could say, right? Cling to felt experience. That they're still kind of centered on how they feel about a problem. They do struggle with abstract thought, right? Which does make theorizing in a more abstract way really complex, but that's also hard for teenagers and older adults too. But if we think about Piaget's theory, right, he assumed that within a stage, your peers roughly have the same sorts of capacities and ways of understanding things as you do. But this is where the theory, falls apart a little bit, because we do know that there are differences within stages and that some kids can think more logically during this period. Okay, so preferences and domains of knowledge, right? Expertise refers to how much a child has learned within a specific domain of knowledge, right? That is in a particular subject matter or content area. So we see that in the concrete operational stage, in the middle childhood years, children can think more abstractly and logically about things they already know a lot about, right? You've probably noticed this, right? If a kid has a real strong interest, for example, like in dinosaurs or a particular game or something like that, right? That they can make these really profound and deep connections, right? These kind of logical connections within a subject area that they know a lot about, right? This is why it's important for teachers and parents to discover what their children's preferences and strengths are, because it's in those areas that you really can, foster these sort of cognitive and logical thinking skills. So if a child has a lot of knowledge within a particular domain, their ability to think logically about problems within that domain
is often more advanced than in other content areas where they have maybe relative weaknesses. It does seem that a child with a lot of domain knowledge is better at identifying, right, important features of a problem within that particular domain, and at noticing and observing the relationships between important features in that domain. And so we can say that logical thinking is, to some degree, domain specific. That means, right, it's applicable to a particular area of knowledge rather than being kind of domain general, right, as Piaget's stage theory implies. So this is where Piaget's stage theory tends to fall apart a little bit, right, where logical thinking skills can be relative to a subject area rather than kind of across the board. For example, right, if you imagine a kid who loves science experiments and likes playing with like chemistry sets, their ability to think and reason about chemistry is probably likely to advance more quickly than for a kid whose passion is in music, for example. And so maybe one other feature that's important to note here is that kids can think more logically when problems are presented to them in a context that makes sense to them. And so again, the kind of key point here is identifying preferences and strengths, and then teaching material to kids in a maybe individualized way based on those preferences and strengths. So another really important advancement in cognitive development in middle childhood is memory. So they've done experiments, for example, where they will ask a 3-year-old versus a 7-year-old, can you tell me what happened when you went to the doctor? So this will happen, they'll do these kinds of studies or experiments, following a doctor's visit. They'll ask the kids to tell them, what they remember from the appointment. And sometimes they'll ask them some silly questions just to see, if they're able to answer accurately and correctly. So for example, if they just went to the doctor for a pediatric visit, they'll say, did they look in your nose? Did they cut your hair? And obviously that second question is meant to see how well they can remember the event itself, because it's really not likely that their doctor gave them a haircut. And then what they do is they ask them again in 3 weeks, 6 weeks, and 12 weeks. Well, what they notice first when they first ask them is that both preschoolers and older kids are able to more or less accurately remember what happened. But the key difference is when they ask them 3, 6, and 12 weeks later. The 7-year-olds retain most of the information even months later. They'll retain up to 90% of their memory accurately. Whereas 3-year-olds will sometimes lose most or all of it, right? They'll just start saying yes to things like, did they cut your hair, right? And so again, we see this huge improvement in memory during middle childhood. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the different realms of memory itself, right? We have sensory memory, which is like a brief retention of sensory experience. So things that we see or hear, right? For a brief kind of split second, we register that experience and it's kind of imprinted into our memory. Sensory memory doesn't seem, the capacity for sensory memory doesn't really seem to change much throughout the lifespan. So a child's capacity for sensory memory is almost the same as an adult's. Working memory, though, does have a limited capacity. We can pay attention to, think about just a limited number of meaningful amounts of information at one time. And generally, the information that we're learning is lost from our working memory within 15 to 30 seconds unless we engage in certain study strategies like rehearsal. Right? Rehearsal would be like making flashcards, repeating the information to ourselves, making a real effort at paying attention. Long-term memory is kind of the overall deeper reservoir of all impressions that we formed over the course of our life, where some of that information is accessible and some isn't. And so, this gets us to understand that that studying and learning does require real effort. And so learning, right, studying is such an important aspect then of learning and acquiring knowledge and information. Right? Much of learning does require real effort, right? This is why study skills are such an important part of succeeding in school, and why they even have in some schools, right, study skills classes or tutoring or, programs that are designed to help students retain, keep, and store information. That learning something, especially in a class like this, right, 6 weeks and it's a ton of information, right, that our ability to pay attention, focus, and review will really make the difference in terms of how much we really learn and remember. This is probably one reason why educators are so concerned about AI, right? Because it's like almost, outsourcing your thinking and, learning skills to, some software program. I will say that I think that is a real concern, right? That it is really important for us to put forth real effort if we're going to actually remember and learn things, that are important to us. We can think about different types of learning. We have implicit learning, right? Refers to things that we learned that didn't require any specific effort, right? So this would be things like learning about relationships by experiencing them. This is going to be a really important aspect of attachment, as we saw in the last module, that our attachment patterns are what might belong to implicit learning, right? That we don't have to expend any real effort learning about relationships because we experience them. And so what we experience and what we remember and take in from these experiences is all a part of our implicit learning. And then we have implicit memory, which would then refer to all the memories we hold that are outside our awareness, right? So this would be kind of more into the unconscious realm, as we saw in the psychoanalytic theory, right? The unconscious being the kind of store of all of these implicit memories, things that we've experienced but that are not in conscious awareness at any given time. So this takes us to talking about different types of knowledge. Okay, we have on the one hand declarative knowledge, which refers simply to knowledge about facts, ideas, and concepts. So if I were to say, give me a definition of attachment, right? Your definition would be knowledge about the facts, ideas, and concepts within attachment itself. That's going to refer to declarative knowledge. And then we have within declarative knowledge, semantic knowledge, which is just factual information, rules and concepts. And then we have this idea of episodic knowledge, which is our knowledge of the events we've experienced in life, often leading to what we call the development of various social scripts. And social scripts just refer to culturally learned patterns of behavior that guide how people act in specific social situations. They kind of function like mental scripts, similar to like a play or a movie script, right? That kind of tell us what to say, what to do, and what to expect in a given context. And then we have procedural knowledge, which refers to our knowledge about the how-to, right? Knowledge about how to do things. So if I were to say, for example, explain to me how to downshift in a manual transmission, right? Or explain to me how to start a car and get it out of park and start driving, right? The knowledge of how to do things is our procedural knowledge. And so what are the kinds of things that improve with age when it comes to our cognitive development? That would be our processing speed. A lot of that has to do with the myelination, right, and the growth of white matter in the brain. Our breadth and depth of knowledge, so how much we know, how widely we know a subject, and not just how widely we know that subject, but how deep our knowledge goes in that subject. As we said, our logical thinking skills begin to improve as we start to decenter, and our working memory improves, allowing us to hold more information in our mind at once. Our language skills improve, so we're able to describe and explain things in more refinement, in a more granular way, with more specific words. And then finally, our metacognitive skills improve, and we'll talk about metacognition next. But first, before we get there, here's maybe a little discussion or a little opportunity for you to reflect on what we've talked about so far. Think about providing an example of something at which you really excelled in elementary school. So it could be academic or non-academic areas. And if possible, connect your skill area to one or more of the executive functions, so like self-regulation, working memory, behavioral inhibition. How much practice was involved in developing this area of expertise? Describe your level of motivation for your performance in this area. What kinds of conditions might have strengthened or weakened your performance? And how does this framework help you understand the role of executive functioning in school and life? So some questions to ponder as you're studying this week. So now let's talk about this idea of metacognition. Metacognition is all about the knowledge of our own mental processes and the ability to reflect on those processes. You can think of this as a level of self-awareness about how we learn and how we think. This is a type of self-monitoring and awareness of how we learn and how we process information. Why would that be important? Well, I think understanding and recognizing our own mental processes can allow us to then choose and select strategies thoughtfully and purposefully about how we will best learn. So this is kind of getting into how do you learn best, right? Flashcards, reading, visual images to accompany your reading. And that's why you can see that throughout the course, right, I'm trying to include things like when we start every new module, we talk about what we know and what we still need to know, right? That's a metacognitive kind of strategy that I've included throughout the course as a way to try to help you maybe develop some of your own metacognitive skills. This allows us to regulate our own learning strategically, right? So like testing ourselves, reflecting on what we're learning, right? Reflecting personally on what we're learning, which is why I asked you those questions on the last slide about connecting some of what we're learning to some of your own personal experience, right? These are all ways of building and developing metacognition, right? Reflecting on how we learn, which then allows us to choose strategies that will effectively help us learn what we need to know. So to some degree, we could say then that the goal of teaching metacognitive strategies in school is to affect some form of behavior change, right? To get us to reflect on ourselves as a way of becoming more, competent students, improving how we think, how we plan, how we execute. To some degree, then, that might, we could say that improved executive functioning, improved thinking, planning, and executing may lead to reductions in impulsivity and inattention, right? When we're really thoughtfully and mindfully aware of how we learn. And overall, right, this improves our knowledge base by using, effective learning and memorization strategies, using an array of recall strategies, right? Like, again, rehearsal, right? Thinking back over what you just read, or kind of repeating something to yourself out loud, right? It's kind of the idea of private speech that we learned in Module 1, right? Or flashcards, or writing down or typing what you're learning, taking little notes on a notepad as you're going, right? These are all different types of metacognitive strategies. And so, the memory strategies we choose do seem to be influenced by our interactions with caregivers and other important people, right? Teachers, caregivers, parents, tutors, mentors, right? These are people who can help us identify and refine, right, some of these metacognitive strategies. All right, like I said, here we could encourage children to use private speech if that works for them, talking with them about their problems, narrating their experiences, right? This is kind of what we talked about with responsive, warm caregiving, right? That we're kind of thinking out loud with kids as a way of kind of helping them process and learn. There's this idea from Vygotsky, right, around scaffolding, right? We use scaffolding to help improve children's cognitive skills. But scaffolding, right, does require us to understand the child's zone of proximal development, which is an idea from the first reading in Module 1, which we didn't get into in the lecture, but the zone of proximal development refers to kind of the boundary or edge of a child's current skill or capacity in a particular domain. So we want to know, like, what is that kind of frustration edge where we're right at the kind of edge or tip of a child's knowledge. And from there, right, we try to then identify the steps or supports that would be needed to push that boundary out a little bit more. And so this does, right, require us to identify, right, a child's needs and strengths. This is why doing an assessment of a child's strengths and needs is such an important point of supporting their cognitive development. But of course, there are important teacher and school factors, right? Just as we said, authoritative parenting is the sort of ideal way of raising a child, we could say that authoritative teaching is also really important, right? That a child's cognitive development does depend on the quality of the environment the child is in, right? And so teachers who are warm and encouraging and supportive, who are able to identify a child's strengths and needs, and help that child develop, the appropriate metacognitive skills, give them appropriately demanding tasks, holding high expectations, having that firm edge of setting boundaries and limits, but also doing so with a soft touch, that's also important for teachers, just as it is for parents, right? That we can think about, authoritative teaching as trying to, address some of the bugs, right, or deficits in a child's knowledge base. So, for example, if we ask a first grader to count a set of 13 blocks and then write down the answer, they'll probably be able to do that fairly easily, right? They can count the numbers of blocks and say there's 13 and then write the number of 13. But if they write the number 13 and then we circle the 3 and then ask them, so does this number 3, does that part of your 13 have anything to do with how many blocks there are? A first grader or a second grader might say no, right? They just think that the whole number 13 is telling us about the whole number of blocks, but what we're really doing is kind of assessing their knowledge of, base 10 in math. As they start to get older, they might say that the 3 represents just a certain number of blocks. As they start to get older, they might recognize that the 1 in 13 represents just one single item instead of 10, right? And it's not until maybe the later elementary years that kids are able to recognize that the 1 represents a 10, right? So not just one single unit, but 10 units. And that the 3 represent 3 ones, right? And so this is just an example of how, kids as they grow, right, are constructing knowledge. So again, assimilating and accommodating information based on what they already know. And this is why, again, I include that what do we know and what do we need to know section in each of our modules, because we build new knowledge based on what we already know. And then once we've learned something, we go back and ask, so what do we know now, but what are we still missing, right? That this is a sort of ongoing cyclical process of learning. So now we're going to talk a little bit about this idea of social cognition, which you might have heard if you've taken a social psychology class. And social cognition generally just refers to the ways people think about other people and how they reason and think about their social relationships in the social world, right? We have different types of attributions that we make. Internal attributions refer to explanations of other people's behavior in terms of their personality, character, or disposition. This is the tendency to assume that people act and behave the way they do because of their personality. On the other hand, we have external attributions, which is explaining other people's behavior in terms of larger contextual or situational circumstances and influences. Right? This is the ability to say, you were really mean to me today, but I can see that it's not just because you're a mean person, but because maybe you're having a bad day today. Maybe there are things that aren't going so well for you today, right? That would be more of an external attribution, right? Saying that there are situational or contextual factors that influence how you behave. That the way you behave isn't entirely a result of your personality or disposition. And so that does require this idea of perspective taking, right? The ability to adopt another person's point of view, which we refer to as theory of mind in Module 1, right? In order to make more external attributions of people's behavior, we need to be able to take their perspective, right? To try to get into their mental state or point of view and understand their actions or behavior as a result of these larger situational or contextual factors, like having a bad day, being sick, being stressed out, that there are all kinds of contextual reasons why a person might be acting a certain way. Or a reason why a person might be really happy could be, again, related to more contextual factors rather than they're just a cheery, happy-go-lucky kind of person that, well, maybe something really nice happened today. But in either case, right, we're trying to take their perspective as a way of understanding their behavior. So now we'll take some time to talk a little bit about friendship, right? Because social life is increasingly important as a kid moves through middle childhood. Longitudinal studies have found that having at least one mutual friend in middle childhood is an important predictor of mental health in adulthood, right? So having friends in the early years of life is predictive of later mental health in adulthood. That friendship is a protective factor, we say. So by protective factor, we mean a factor in life, like friendship, for example, that kind of buffers or protects us from stress or strain, right? So social relationships become a really helpful and important way of coping with challenges and setbacks and disappointments. And so a kid who's not treated well at home, who's maybe neglected or abused a lot and doesn't have any friendship, we can imagine that under those circumstances, we're going to have more negative outcomes later in life. And so perspective-taking skills and friendship seem to go hand in glove, right? They go together. Improvements in executive functions, especially working memory, facilitate this perspective-taking skill, right? That there is a correlation, a positive correlation between executive functioning and perspective-taking skills. So what are the environmental factors that promote growth in executive functioning? Again, a secure attachment, positive responsive caregiving, sibling relationships, right? So this is relevant where, I asked you in the kind of getting to know you discussion prompt, do you have siblings or are you an only child, right? That having siblings is actually helpful in terms of developing executive functioning. Because when you have siblings, you have other people that you have to keep in mind and think about. Opportunity for social interaction with peers, getting kids involved in social activities becomes a really important part of developing friendship and perspective-taking skills. And of course, along the way, there are, like we said, little bumps and bruises and ruptures, but those can be repaired, right, in the context of a supportive relationship. So let's talk a little bit about healthy friendships, right? The healthiest relationships are marked by mutual give and take, in which both partners feel understood, respected, and affirmed. So instead of only thinking in terms of what is good for me, we're thinking about what is good for us, what is good for our relationship. There's this idea of boundaries versus walls, right? Boundaries are important in terms of having limits, right? How much of myself do I want to give to others? Whereas walls, right, we can think of as keeping people out, right? And they're not really the same, right? Boundaries can be crossed. Walls can't really be penetrated. So, when we feel that we need to build walls to keep people out, right, that says something, right, about our development. Whereas having healthy boundaries implies knowledge of, what feels good to me, in a relationship with someone else. How much of myself do I want to give to others, but then how often do I also feel received by others? This relates to the concepts of individuation and attachment. Right? Individuation referring to becoming an individual, right? Kind of stepping outside of your social relationships and being a self, right? Having an identity. But also attachment, right? Being able to connect and join with others, right? So both are important. Individuation and attachment are different dimensions, but both are important to healthy relationships in life, right? Having a sense of self and having a sense of personal identity and boundaries, but also the capacity to join and connect and be with others. This idea of egocentrism is this idea of being unable to see or understand things from a different perspective. This would be kind of like a deficit in perspective-taking skills, right? Something that happens to all of us to some degree, right? None of us are perfect in this way. We all sometimes get kind of wrapped up in ourselves. But we do seem to get better at decentering in the context of, right, a supportive, positive relationship in which we have enough humility to see our own part in creating a dynamic, right? So this is our ability to take accountability and ownership of when we fall short, right? Understanding the contributions we make sometimes to toxic patterns of communication or behavior, that we're not just passively receiving maltreatment from others, that sometimes we're also contributing to those very patterns. So here we're going to talk, and I'll post this on Canvas as well, Selman's stages of friendship, which is a kind of another sort of stage theory that implies to some degree kind of what we should expect at different ages. This model is based primarily on the development of perspective taking skills from the early years through adulthood. And the age ranges here, I should say, are rough approximations. Doesn't imply, any sort of absolute breaks between certain ages. But you can take a look here at this chart to kind of see what are the types of social perspective taking skills that we ought to expect at different ages, the different types of shared experience. As we can see in stage 0, right, in the early years, like from 3 years old through like maybe kindergarten, that kids are not yet well individuated, right? There's a lot of enmeshment or entanglement in their relationships with others, not a lot of separation between me and you. And so their thinking and their perspective taking seems to be very, self-focused, very egocentric. And so, this is where reactivity and impulsivity tend to be much higher. And as you can see here, as we move down the stages, our ability to take in more information, to separate ourselves more, to differentiate between me and you, to have a more reciprocal, mutual relationship improves over time. And I think the reason our ability to form healthy friendships and relationships improves over time because cognitive development is improving, right? Perspective taking skills are improving. And of course, all of this is likely to go much, much better when we learn, care and trust in our early relationships. So here again, just kind of outlines the different stages of friendship. We'll kind of go through these quickly here, right? Like we said in stage 0, friendship is defined in very concrete terms, right? Little understanding of another person's mental state or psychology. We would say very little kind of mentalizing ability, not having the capacity for a robust theory of mind quite yet. And then from about 5 to 9, friendship is still not maybe completely mutual. It's difficult for kids to hold their perspective and another person's perspective simultaneously. And if you think about that, that makes sense in terms of what we've talked about with cognitive development, right? This would be like holding multiple pieces of information at the same time, right? Which would imply, more enhanced working memory. That it's difficult for kids in stage 1 to accurately infer what others are thinking about them. And as you can see, when we move up to stage 2, which is like roughly the 3rd grade to 5th grade, friendship is now becoming a bit more mutual. Friendships also become more intense, right? As we're better able to take others' perspective. And then as we move from elementary to middle school and high school, right, we can take a greater third-person perspective, holding both our perspective and another person's perspective simultaneously. And then the idea here is that in stage 4, we're adopting the perspective of culture and society, that we're able to not only integrate my perspective, your perspective, but the larger societies and cultures' perspectives. So that's holding quite a lot of information in our mind. And so here are some questions to mull over when we talk again about that dynamic interaction between nature and nurture. Right? What are the biologically based factors that might make perspective taking and keeping and maintaining friends more difficult? That might point to things like more internalizing problems, higher reactivity, higher impulsivity, might make it harder for us to take another person's perspective and maintain friendships. To what extent does the family and larger cultural context matter in terms of developing perspective-taking skills? In other words, how much do the adults model perspective-taking skills for children? Remember, a big part of how we learn is what's modeled for us. So do the adults in the culture model perspective-taking skills? You can imagine that in the society we're living in today, right, lots of polarization, lots of real intense sort of splitting between bad and good. Our team is the good side, the other side is the bad side. That this we see quite clearly, right, in a lot of our political discourse today, right, of breakdowns in perspective taking and mentalization of other people's experiences. What happens if a child doesn't live in a safe neighborhood with easy access to opportunities for play and socialization? Right, that's going to be a relevant aspect of. That's going to be an important environmental factor in terms of developing perspective taking. What if there's persistent family conflict at home? How might that impact friendships? And so these are really important, maybe assessment questions we want to keep in mind if we're working with children, to kind of think about the environmental factors that facilitate perspective taking skills in friendship. So here we're talking about different psychosocial skills, right? Friendship understanding, knowledge about what friendship implies, right? Friendship implies a type of mutual concern for me and another person. Friendship skills, right? Behavioral skills like appropriate assertiveness, good communication patterns, conflict resolution, right? It's important at times to assert our needs and feelings, right? That we're not like a doormat, right? That we get steamrolled by other people. Right, that we're able to appropriately, and that's the key word, right? Appropriately assert our feelings and needs, demonstrating good patterns of communication, being able to non-judgmentally express a thought or feeling, and to be able to non-judgmentally and empathically receive another person's point of view. Friendship valuing, right? Seeing the importance of friendship by emotionally attaching and investing in friendship. Right, so to what extent does a child value peers and friends by investing, in friends and friendship? So our interpersonal orientation is a way of talking about how we characteristically act in social contexts. So this is kind of striking a balance between needs for intimacy and needs for autonomy. Right? We have a need for intimacy, a need for closeness and connection, but at the same time, we have a need for autonomy, right? To be separate and to kind of make up our own mind about things. An other transforming orientation would refer to a dominant or, to dominate or coerce others to do what we want them to do. This is kind of like referring to more psychological control, manipulation, right? Changes other people to avoid conflict. Whereas we have a more self-transforming orientation, which is typically more submissive, right? Giving in to avoid conflicts or problems. We change ourselves to avoid interpersonal conflict. So both of these orientations have their limitations and issues, right? We don't want to avoid conflict either by having to manipulate or coerce someone to act in a certain way, but neither do we want to have to completely submit and give up and kind of, relinquish our own needs and feelings in order to avoid conflict. That both of these are sort of pitfalls. So here, just another sort of moment to stop, pause, and think and reflect. If you can remember struggling with some subject or concept in school, describe the impact of that experience on your sense of competence and industry, right? Industry referring to how hardworking you felt you were. Have you resolved that struggle? If so, how? So now we're going to move to this idea of self-concept, right? Moving from concrete descriptors to more abstract adjectives over time. So, for example, a really small child's self-concept might be really focused on more concrete descriptors. So if you were to ask, a 4-year-old to describe themselves, they might just focus on more sort of superficial identity markers like gender maybe, or their age, or their family status or something like that. They focus more on these concrete descriptions of who they are. And over time we start to, as our language skills improve, right, adopt more abstract adjectives to describe ourselves. Other people's responses and our anticipation and expectation of how we will be treated by them shape what we call our looking glass self, right? How we see ourselves through the eyes of other people. This implies a kind of learning theory model. Our sense of self is shaped by the antecedents and consequences of our behavior. That we want to also consider working models of attachment, as we learned in Module 2. And that this is not a unidimensional concept, right? There are several dimensions or facets of self-concept. It's not that we have just an overall, integrated whole self-concept, that our self-concept may have different compartments, dimensions, buckets. And so when we talk about structure of self-concept, in grade school, kids begin to develop an academic self-concept related to their perceived ability, talent, aptitude across all the different domains of knowledge, right? Math, reading, and science. So this academic self-concept refers to whether or not we think that we are, competent in school, that we have the skills it takes to do well in school. The non-academic self-concept is comprised of more physical, social, and emotional traits. And as kids age, they give more elaborate self-appraisals, right, as their cognitive skills increase. This is, like I said, using more abstract concepts to describe ourselves, right? Like industrious would be a kind of a big word to use to describe myself, right? That I see myself as being hardworking. Cognitive development then does shape our self-concept to the extent that it provides advanced language and ideas, leading to a more complex sense of self. So our self-understanding grows, is kind of positively correlated with our cognitive development. So research has generally supported the idea that our self-esteem and self-worth are correlated with success at tasks that matter to us personally. Right? In other words, when we do poorly at things that we value the most, our self-esteem takes a big hit. Right? If we do poorly at something that doesn't really matter to us, our self-esteem is relatively maybe unaffected. We can more easily discount a weak performance if it occurred in a domain that is relatively unimportant to us. So for example, if I'm really bad at math, but math isn't really important to me, or I don't really consider math important, I might be able to discount or overlook my poor math performance because I might say, well, I'm not really a math person, so I don't really care if I'm good at math, right? That might be an example of discounting weak performance in a domain that's unimportant. Is poor school performance, low achievement, a major cause of low self-esteem among children? What do children value the most? Children tend to put more stock in how their peers see them as they age. So the appraisals of their peers become almost more important than appraisals of teachers or parents, right? That they really start to care more about what their fellow, classmates think of them. And so this leads to things like social comparisons, right? Observing others as a way of evaluating one's own competency, performance, success, right? This is especially salient in novel or ambiguous contexts. So in new situations, we tend to evaluate our performance based on how other people did. We have this self-enhancing bias, right, which refers to our tendency to maintain generally positive views of ourself, right, that it's important to maintain a certain level of self-esteem. But then we also have this idea of downward social comparisons, right, which occur when we try to preserve our self-esteem by comparing ourselves to peers that we perceive as less successful, talented, or competent. So children with low self-esteem tend to prefer adults who offer lots of positive feedback. They are also more susceptible to reactive to more negative feedback. And so, there are kids who you might note having kind of low self-esteem when they tend to cling more to the teachers in school and spend less time with their peers, right? A young person who prefers the company of adults to children their own age might do so because they really want to be close to, positive, caring adults because they might not feel very liked or appreciated by their peers, right? But at the same time, they might be really sensitive to more negative feedback from adults. So there is strong evidence, right, that links global self-esteem to positive life outcomes across the lifespan, right? Improved job satisfaction and relationship satisfaction, more positive and fewer negative emotional experiences. And since self-esteem is related to one's relational experiences, then teachers and helpers can potentially make a significant difference here, right? That caring adults can help boost or prop up a child's sense of self-esteem. But that having a healthy level of self-esteem, you can understand why that might be really important for success later in life. That if we have a positive view of ourselves, then we're more likely to try new things, right? Go out on a limb, right? Take risks and challenges. And so we have different kinds of self-valuing, right? Self-efficacy, which is the belief that I can do this, I'm competent, right? Self-efficacy is a sense of personal competence, right? Setbacks are not viewed as personal failings. This is related to Erikson's psychosocial model of industry, right? Which emerges during this period as a sign that a child is becoming more actively engaged with daily living tasks and challenges, that they are able to kind of take more on and try new things. On the other hand, we have like narcissism, right, which is kind of more excessive self-preoccupation, right? The belief that everything refers back to me somehow. An inability to integrate and take ownership of aggression, hostility, negative affect. Narcissists do well when others stay within, predetermined limits, right, set by the narcissist. And so there's a lot of talk in recent years, especially on TikTok or social Instagram, right, around narcissistic behaviors and traits. You can get into this a little bit more in our reading this week. But some of the major sources of narcissism would be, things like chronic and persistent deprivation in childhood. And by deprivation, I just mean not receiving much care and attention in early life. And you might kind of scratch your head and wonder, how can that be? I thought that, a kid who's like spoiled rotten would be really narcissistic. And, that can be true, but it's also true that kids actually who receive very little love and attention, very little care and support, can also develop narcissistic traits because there's a kind of preoccupation with their own deficits. Why have I not received the love and care that I'm owed, right? That I'm sort of owed a certain level of recognition and being valued. And if I don't get that at all in life, right, I might be really preoccupied with making up for or compensating for a lack of that kind of attention in early life. On the other hand, right, parents who really overvalue their children's skills and abilities, right, that can lead to sort of narcissistic self-conceptions, right? The idea that my child is the most special child. And then we have this idea of kind of a positive versus a negative narcissist, which is less important for this class, so we're just going to skip past that for now. So I'll talk a little bit about cultural differences when it comes to some of these concepts. And there's this interesting idea that you'll see in the reading on this notion of loss of voice for girls as they enter adolescence. Do girls learn to quiet their voices and lose a sense of authenticity when they enter adolescence? The idea here is that maybe little girls who are a little bit more willful, more kind of self-directed, more imperious, in order to identify with, certain appropriate culturally prescribed roles of women, maybe learn to silence themselves, to kind of lose their kind of authentic self in order to fill the role of kind of being a woman in society or culture, which women are supposed to be more self-sacrificing and more pleasing to others, right? So that's the idea that Gilligan and her colleagues are trying to research is this is a typical phenomenon that girls experience as they move from early childhood to adolescence. But I think the truth is a little bit more kind of complex. What research does show is that both girls and boys suffer from declining levels of self-esteem as they enter older childhood and adolescence. And as we'll look at in another slide coming up, right, children from racial and ethnic minority groups can also suffer from lower self-esteem as a result of this sort of marginalized social status, perhaps, right? That plays an important role in a person's self-esteem. But what's important is not to buy into this idea of a sort of self-esteem slide that all kids are going to enter into as they get into adolescence, because that could kind of create what we call a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So if an adult believes that girls have lower self-esteem than boys, there are ways that they can like unconsciously, subtly convey that impression to girls, right? In ways that sort of reinforce the notion that they do have low self-esteem. Right? Girls can then internalize those messages and, alter their own self-appraisals according to those subtle, unconscious communications. Additionally, right, championing the self-esteem deficits of girls may lead some to conclude that boys, right, don't have self-esteem problems. And clearly there are gender role strains on boys in this period too, right? There is some research that indicates that they are more likely than girls to feel social pressure to conform to gender stereotypes. So I think that's the kind of takeaway here, is that both girls and boys are going to experience some social pressure to have to conform to certain gender stereotypes. And then you can imagine, that non-binary or transgender youth are going to experience, much more kind of social pressure and strain when their identities are sort of discounted or not seen as valid. This graph just shows us the rates of self-esteem across the lifespan. So starting on the left, we're looking at kind of middle childhood all the way to late adulthood. So there is some research here, and as you can see, that like the absolute levels of self-esteem for men tend to be relatively higher than women for a good deal of the lifespan. But interestingly, women's reported level of self-esteem seems to pass men toward the end of life, which I guess raises some interesting questions about why you think that might be. We'll talk about this idea again of minority stress and self-esteem. A kind of common sense view of self-esteem is that people from marginalized backgrounds or ethnic racial minorities would suffer from lower self-esteem, right? Because their identities are relatively marginalized in society. And there are at least 3 different processes that play out to buffer against what some refer to as minority stress. And they are, right, 1, attributing negative feedback or discrimination to the prejudices of a broken society. So in other words, if you hear racist comments, you might say, well, that has nothing to do with me personally. That's just a reflection of the type of broken racist society we live in. So in other words, you can preserve your self-esteem by saying, but that's not really me. That's just kind of how this racist, sort of society functions. Number 2, right, social comparisons are made within the group rather than between racial groups. So instead of making comparisons between me, for instance, like say, like a young African-American male might not compare himself to a white male of his same age, but rather to another African-American male within his community. So we make social comparisons within groups rather than between groups. And then 3, right, elevating the importance of self-esteem domains in which members of their group typically or traditionally or historically succeed, while discounting domains in which members of their group maybe struggle more or historically tend to struggle. So it's kind of emphasizing the strengths over the, sort of deficits. So we'll talk about this idea of independence versus interdependence, right? Is it okay to stand out and show pride in your accomplishments? Is it important for you to be actively involved in shaping the norms and rules of your community? Are your opinions valued, and is it important for you to express your opinions? So the way we answer these questions reveal a lot about how we would act and behave as parents, interestingly, right? So if you take some time to read over these questions and answer them, it gives you a little bit of a window, right, into how you might think about, raising a child of your own someday. Here we're going to break down the kind of idea of individualistic versus collectivistic cultures, and talk about some of the differences in values and emphases between these types of culture. So again, when we talk about individualistic cultures, we're typically referring to the sort of like Western nations, North America, Australia, Western Europe, and so on. When we talk about collectivistic cultures, we're talking more about East Asia, South Asia, Latin America, Africa, and so on, right? And that these different cultures have different value systems. And as you can see here, right, in individualistic cultures, becoming autonomous and self-reliant is important, right? This includes separating from others and following one's own unique course in life, making one's own choices and decisions, right? Being more autonomous and individual. Whereas in a collectivistic culture, right, relatedness rather than autonomy is emphasized, right? Personal choices are subordinated or less important than the needs of the group. Okay, and so these are different orientations based on different cultural systems, and we can understand then how coming from one or the other kind of culture will lead to what it is that we really value and how we act and behave and what's important to us. So now we'll talk a little bit about the moral self, right? How important is morality to self-concept? The capacity to make judgments about what is right and what is wrong, and preferring to behave and act in ways deemed right. This involves an evaluative orientation, right? And a commitment to behave in ways that are consistent with what is right. Right? The ability to evaluate, what is right and what is wrong. Keeping that kind of conscience active and going. So what is the nature of early moral development? So we'll talk a little bit again about the role of parents, teachers, and caregivers. So going back to the psychoanalytic theory, right? Freud believed that the superego is the heir to the Oedipal conflict in the early years. So by identifying with one parent, or in some cases both parents, right, the child simultaneously resolves this Oedipal struggle and adopts and internalizes a code of behavior that reflects this chosen parent's beliefs or attitudes. So it's kind of like aligning yourself with that parent's worldview. Right? So parents then become very important in terms of shaping our ideas of morality, right and wrong, and conscience, right? Developing a conscience. Our experiences with others, our interactions with people over time give us some sense of the consequences of our behavior, consequences of our actions and behavior. This is getting into kind of the more behavioral or learning theory, right? That we learn about right and wrong based on our experience, based on the consequences of what we do. Parents and teachers are generally interested in imparting moral views and a sort of moral fiber in children, right? Functioning democracies, organized communities, right? It's often said and believed, do depend on the right actions of people, right? Having some social norms, rules, obligations that we all generally recognize as important. You could think of this as like, just being generally courteous, polite, and cordial. Like, what are the sort of general social norms around cooperation and collaboration? So some of the important elements of morality then would be, concern for others, right? So again, this implies a kind of perspective taking, having some concern or care for the perspective of others. This idea of justice, fairness, right? What is right? What is owed? Trustworthiness and honesty, self-control, right? If I'm going to live by a sort of moral code of right and wrong, I have to be able to control myself then and, override my impulses to do what's right. Emotions, cognitions, and behaviors all work together to produce moral responses. So I pulled this quote from a book by this German philosopher named Hans-Georg Müller, and his book is called The Moral Fool, if you're interested in checking that out. It's some interesting reading. But he says, morality is not the root. The root is the natural attachment and emotional bond that grows between family members. So I think what he's trying to get at here in terms of early moral development is that it's not by learning right and wrong that we learn to act right. Right? He's saying it's our natural attachment and the emotional bond that we form and that grows between family members that gives us a sense of care, compassion, and love for others, right? Especially for family members, that it's our love connection, right, to family members that sort of trumps or overrides moral considerations, right? Like, this is getting at the idea of kind of like a more unconditional love for somebody really important to us. That even if a person we really love does something wrong, we can still love them even though they did something wrong. That we don't look at their moral failure as a reason not to love them anymore, right? That in this sense, having a sort of loving and caring relationship to another person kind of trumps morality. And there's some other kind of philosophical views of moral development, right? In the Western intellectual tradition, you have the philosopher Immanuel Kant, right? He wrote very extensively on morality and ethics. And his views really remain popular today among, ethicists, philosophers, psychologists. Good conduct and moral standing is achieved through a rigorously rational approach, which leads to autonomy, right? Self-governing, right? Somebody who is mature is somebody who can govern themselves. Maturity implies the capacity to rationally arrive, at the right conclusions about what is right behavior. And so here, right, morality is founded on right thinking, right? The capacity to rationally perceive and actualize the truth. In the Eastern intellectual tradition, right, Confucian concepts such as filial piety and parental love are believed to be the root of moral behavior and good conduct. In this sense, morality is founded on something actually amoral, and this is why there is no social norm or morality that can outweigh family bonds. Here, morality is founded on emotion, right, on attachment. So here we'll talk a little bit about Lawrence Kohlberg's theory of moral development. So the psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg developed this theory of how we develop morally, how we develop as moral beings over time. And so he examines how moral reasoning changes over the course of the lifespan. And so again, you'll see a lot of parallels in this lecture between moral development, self-development, and cognitive development. That is, our moral development and self-development expand as our cognitive development expands. And so what he did to develop this theory is that he presented these, broad-based ethical or moral dilemmas to people of different ages and paid attention to the reasoning they used to justify their responses. So, this is the classic, would you steal bread to feed your family, right? So he would present these different ethical dilemmas to people and ask them to answer. And then he would record and pay attention to their justifications for acting in the way that they did. And so he then outlined these different types of morality, right? Pre-conventional morality refers to conforming to the dictates of authority. What is right is what avoids punishment or advances one's interests. So here you could think about, children who are raised in authoritarian households, right? With authoritarian parenting, that the right thing to do is whatever avoids getting punished. And so just doing whatever you're told to do, right? Whatever the authority tells you to do is what's right. Conventional morality looks at what is right is what keeps society in order. Approval of others matters more at this stage. So conventional morality is more about how do we get social harmony, right? The right thing to do is whatever keeps us together in a sort of harmonious way. And then post-conventional morality is about having these universal principles or standards of justice that supersede particular rules or specific cases. So in other words, there are certain principles or standards that rise above any particular rules. And so those universal principles or standards of justice are more important than specific edge cases. And so what Kohlberg noted, right, is that individuals might reach the same conclusion about what is right to do, but arrive there by very different reasons and means. So our social interactions and perspective-taking skills would then strongly influence our moral reasoning, right? So if I am able to take multiple perspectives and hold those all simultaneously, that's going to influence, right, what I consider to be morally right or morally wrong. So we have different types of rules, right? We have moral rules, conventional rules, and personal rules. Moral rules referring to rules regarding fundamental moral issues such as justice, fairness, welfare, and rights. Conventional rules, right, refer to standards of conduct that are more culturally specific, like gender norms, dress codes, general social etiquette. What is the appropriate way to dress and act? Personal rules refer to standards of conduct and behavior that are more localized to an individual family or group of friends. Right, so there might be certain social norms that you follow in public, but then at home maybe there are different types of norms for how we interact and treat each other. So again, this is just a way of emphasizing again metacognitive skill, right, that we touched on earlier. That as we go through the course, right, throughout each module, you'll be expected to think about what I know, what I still need to know. You can even think about what I want to know, right? And this is a way of organizing your learning, right? So if we were to say one of the objectives here is you will be able to explain important milestones and developmental achievements of early childhood and the processes that mediate them, if that were your objective, in the left, right, we talk about, well, what do we know about the processes that mediate important milestones? So if you don't know what those processes are, that would be in a need to know, right? Well, I need to know what are the specific processes that mediate these important milestones. Or maybe you can say what some of these milestones are, right? Like perspective taking skills, friendship, right? And so on, that these are important milestones that we achieve, developmental achievements related to cognitive development, right? Like moving through the concrete operational stage, having more expanded executive functioning, right? So these are examples of things that we would want to think about. How much of this do we know right now? What do we still need to know? And then maybe even considering, like, well, what is it that I would want to know about important milestones and developmental achievements? So we'll kind of end in a few slides here talking about pro-social behavior, antisocial behavior. Starting with pro-social behavior. This is behavior that is intended to help others or benefit someone else. We sometimes refer to this as altruistic behavior, right? Somebody who is altruistic is somebody who's primarily interested in helping or benefiting somebody else. There are a variety of motivations and individual differences for pro-social behavior, right? People can be motivated to help others for a variety of different reasons. Empathy can strengthen and promote pro-social behavior. Empathy being the capacity to put myself in your shoes, see the world through your eyes. That if I am able to do that, that's a way of, strengthening, pro-social behavior, helping others. Small kids might be able to share a feeling without necessarily taking the other's perspective, just feeling bad without knowing exactly why, right? So we see the kind of slowly developing capacity for empathy. A capacity for empathy and sympathy for others increases from the early years through adulthood. So small children tend to be very egocentric, right? Focused on themselves. And then as we grow gradually over time, as our cognitive development improves, as our executive functioning improves, we are able to expand that capacity for empathy. Influences on pro-social behavior, again, as will not be surprising at this point, there are cognitive contributions, right? Improved reasoning and perspective-taking skills strengthen pro-social behavior. Needs-based reasoning, weighing my needs against those of others. Temperament and personality, right? Certain personality traits and characteristics can facilitate more pro-social behavior, like lower neuroticism, lower anxiety, right? May be correlated with more pro-social behavior. So there's maybe a sort of negative correlation between anxiety and prosociality, where the less anxious I am, the more capacity I might have for pro-social behaviors. Also the role of self-regulation, right, which implies an ability to regulate myself, control some of my own impulses, at the extent to which I have impulse control and can regulate myself, the more likely I am to be able to help other people. And we'll talk about antisocial behaviors, which refer to intent to harm or injure someone. So antisocial in the context of our class doesn't mean like somebody who doesn't like socializing with other people, right? That's not what we mean by antisocial. By antisocial, we mean like actually having the intention to harm or injure or hurt somebody, right? Cheating, lying, stealing, physical, verbal attacks. And that lying, occurs throughout the lifespan, right? That most people, all people probably will tell some kinds of lies, right? At different ages and stages in life, right? To avoid punishment, to promote their self-interest, right? To get something that they want, and so on, right? Adolescents are more likely to tell the truth and fess up than preschoolers. And this, again, I think this is because adolescents or teenagers are more likely to have more advanced moral reasoning skills, right? More logical reasoning skills, more perspective-taking skills, which kind of push them more towards being, truthful, right? Whereas preschoolers have not yet developed that sense of being able to understand maybe the consequences of lying yet. So they just lie because they don't see it as being particularly problematic. So lying also changes in line with cognitive development, right? The more executive functioning, the more perspective taking, the more cognitive development there is, the less likely people are to lie, compulsively. We'll talk a little bit here about aggression, right? Temper tantrums and power struggles are pretty normal in early childhood. There are sort of major declines in aggressive behavior from ages 2 to 4. This idea of kind of moving from instrumental aggression to relational aggression, where relational aggression refers more to, teasing or criticizing or insulting somebody as a way to put them down in a sort of relationship, whereas instrumental aggression is more like doing something aggressive in order to get something you want. We're talking here about the hostile attributional bias, right, which is a biased interpretive style in which one perceives threats even in neutral situations. So this would be kind of the tendency to think that people are acting kind of maliciously towards you, where you perceive threats even in situations where it's not obvious that there's a real threat. And there is a relationship between executive functions and aggression, right? Poor self-regulation is strongly correlated with more aggressive behavior. And then we'll end the lecture here on bullies and victims. Right? Some children can be both bullies and victims of bullying. So in some cases, kids who bully have often themselves been at the receiving end of hostility and aggression from somebody else. Right? This is the kind of classic example of, a kid who takes a lot of crap at home, right? A kid who is insulted or belittled at home, right, will maybe act out a lot of that aggression at school with their peers, right, particularly with more vulnerable kids. They'll find their own vulnerable person to pick on, right, sort of identifying with the aggressor. Children who jockey for position within the social hierarchy at school are more likely to use relational aggression and bullying. Then we have this idea of pure bullies who do not suffer victimization versus pure victims who are the recipients of bullying but do not victimize others. And we see differences between these two categories, right? Where the pure bullies, the kids who aren't bullied but that do bully, display more externalizing problems. So like, yelling, shouting, acting out, lack of impulse control. Whereas the pure victims, right, the kids who are bullied but who do not bully others, experience more internalizing problems. That would be kind of experiencing like, more depressive thoughts, more anxiety. Bullying and victimization are correlated with fewer friendships, more relational struggles, and isolation. So we're going to end here for Module 3. Do go over some of the key points in this lecture in your reading. There is a lot of reading, and there are a lot more details that are covered in the reading, but I've hoped to cover some of the main points here for you. And I look forward to seeing you all in Module 4.